Is Lemmy the king of rock and roll? Yes. Why? Because I said so. And it's my program. Now, is Elvis the king of rock and roll? Yes. Is Little Richard the king of rock and roll? Yes. Is Jerry Lee Lewis the king of rock and roll? Yes. Is Chuck Berry the king of rock and roll? Yes. There are other worlds than these, and in many other worlds, there could be many kings ruling the same kingdom. That is how I choose to approach it. If you don't like it, start your own dumb podcast. Write your own dumb book. Speak your own dumb truth. It's not as good as mine, but I'm sure it'll do for you. To me, it's like Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and one Mr. Jerry Lee Lewis. We're all their own kings of their own kingdoms, or around their own round table, right? And then the kingdom was left to chaos and disorder and various rivaling, squabbling nations in a feudal system. But then, without even trying, Lemmy Kilmister strides up to the sword and the stone, takes it for himself without so much as a wink or a nod or a sneeze, and marches on, unencumbered. For the next, 4, 5 decades of his life as a performing, recording musician, singer, lyricist, writer, cameo appearance maker in films, style maker in a way that no one can follow. Originator and perfectionizer of the hard-living lifestyle of rock and roll. He did it harder than anybody. He did it better than anybody. He did it more consistently than anybody without a drop-off in quality of his work or his work ethic or his commitment to a sustained intake of chemicals that, while not admirable in and of itself as a practice, he made it work for him. And he put everyone else to shame. He just went through life being himself. Nothing he did could have been taken away by anyone else. He was not a pretender. He was not a imaginary creation of his own mind or any marketing team or any record label. Toward the end of his life, he was interviewed for WWE because one of their more prominent wrestlers that married the boss's daughter and now basically runs the company was a huge Motorhead fan and had Motorhead do 3 different songs for his entrance music, and they had him perform at WrestleMania a couple times. It's very, very cool to watch. But towards the end of his life, when he was probably still weak, but not really, really sick, he was being interviewed at the Rainbow by this guy, Paul Levesque, known as Triple H, and announcer, former wrestler named Cody Graves. And of course, I had to watch it, and I was struck by how basic some of the questions were, how non-rock and roll the questions were. They were like, you really had to be true to yourself. You really had to be legitimately, untouchable, and you had to be honest in your music all the time. And, of course, Lemmy's responses aren't the greatest to those questions, but he does tell some good stories. Although he's weak and his voice isn't very, very loud. But I realized that for the audience they're talking to, especially a young audience, they don't have the luxury of speaking the way other documentarians would speak to a rock and roll audience. They're talking to a mass audience or a sportsy audience or a sports entertainment audience. And they're trying to get across the fact that, like, hey, I know you probably think most musicians are bullshit. Most rock and roll is bullshit because it's all a big farce now. It's all just put on by video game companies and record labels, what there are left of them. It's all just stunts. It's all just, Instagram bullshit and people tricking you into paying attention. It's hip hop, it's bro country, it's bullshit. But Lemmy's the real deal. And this old, decrepit man still sitting in his favorite bar, hanging out with us, is someone you can't fuck with. Throughout this episode, I'm going to go through pretty much the whole history of Lemmy's career. I wanted to do this as an addendum to the Airheads episode because I'm just basically this whole series is an exercise of me shoehorning my attempts to tell rock and roll history into the history of films made about rock and roll. Airheads was the one that Lemmy appeared in, and they used the phrase "Lemmy is God" as one of the jokes. So instead of going after like a trauma film that he had a cameo in or something else like that, I decided Airheads would be the one I would kind of graft this story onto, but certainly not in the commentary. Although I did take up a good amount of the commentary talking about Lemmy. If you are listening to this and you haven't heard my other episodes, I would ask that you please go back to the Airheads episode. Even if you don't want to hear the whole commentary, I would say listen to the first 3 minutes. That's all. And then jump back here. Okay? Or you don't have to do that. You can just listen to this, then go back. But don't neglect that part, is all I'm saying. All right? I would like to read the following passage written by Ian Christie from his book, Sound of the Beast, The Complete Headbanging History of Heavy Metal. Punk did renew England's sense of musical identity and fortunately kick-started a fresh wave of rudimentary heavy metal. In 1977, the same year the label introduced The Damned, Stiff Records released the self-titled debut by Motorhead, a band whose dedication to extremes made even punk rock seem uptight. Motorhead leader Ian Kilmister, a.k.a. Lemmy, was a former roadie for the Jimi Hendrix Experience and a popular member of the LSD-fueled space rock roustabouts, Hawkwind. Leveraging natural beauty, facial warts, and missing teeth, with a tattoo that read, "Born to Lose," Lemmy defied the appeal of rock star pretty boys far beyond even the rascally Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols. He was a quick-witted and charismatic endorsement for dangerous living, and became the grand lord of dirty indifference, while fans copied his outlaw wardrobe of bullet belts, denim vests, cowboy shirts, and Motorhead patches. Minding the gap between Black Sabbath and the punk explosion, Motorhead members were rude long hairs on a speed binge of hammering bass chords, distorted guitar, and rumbling drums, steering clear of politics or mythic heroes, and singing with gravel in place of vocal cords. Lemmy trafficked in debauched songs about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The furious initial string of Motorhead albums, Overkill, Bomber, and Ace of Spades, choked the English music charts, impressing on metal fans that a band could succeed commercially without sacrificing its blunt power and integrity. Black Sabbath had introduced heavy metal, Judas Priest gave it flash, and Motorhead fortified it with true grit. So equipped, heavy metal swallowed punk rock and pressed forward. Would you like to know the definition of the word gelignite? Gelignite, also known as blasting gelatin or simply jelly, is an explosive material consisting of collodion cotton, dissolved in either nitroglycerin or nitroglycol, and mixed with wood pulp and saltpeter. Also mentioned is it's a gel of nitroglycerine and nitrocellulose in a base of wood pulp and sodium or potassium nitrate, used particularly for rock blasting, and invented in 1875 by Swedish chemist Alfred Nobel, who also, shock, horror, surprise, invented dynamite. Don't worry, this will all come into play later. I promise there is a reason for telling you this. Right, so let's get into it proper. The life of Mr. Ian Kilmister begins on Christmas Eve, 1945, in a place called Stoke-on-Trent. He's born with a perforated eardrum and whooping cough. Very, very weak. I guess the midwife on duty advised his parents to request an emergency christening for fear he wouldn't survive more than a few days. But, of course, he did. He didn't meet his real father until he was 25 years old and living in a squat in Earl's Court. Lemmy describes his father as a horrible little fucker, bald with glasses. They separated when I was 3 months old, then later divorced. I guess Lemmy only agreed to meet his father after all that time because Dad had been writing letters to Lemmy's mom saying, "I feel bad about the boy." Lemmy, commented he probably couldn't even remember my fucking name, the boy. They met up for pizza around the corner from the squat where Lemmy was crashing. And Lemmy tells him that he needs money for a new amplifier for his band and wanted to see if his dad would sort of pitch in some cash and help his music career get off the ground. And instead, his dad told him he would be happy to help pay for some truck driving lessons to be a commercial lorry driver of some kind. According to Lemmy, he said, "It's a good thing the pizza hasn't arrived yet. It'd be your new fucking hat." And I walked out. I never saw him again. But that's young man Lemmy. Let's go back to young boy Lemmy. When he was 10 years old, his mom had tried to remarry a very nice, seemingly nice guy named George Willis. And he had played professional football for the Bolton Wanderers, as he told it. Lemmy calls him a self-made man with his own factory, which made plastic shoe stands for shop windows. That went bust. This is, according to Lemmy, about 3 months after my mom married him. He was too much. He was fucking funny as shit. He kept getting busted for selling purloined washing machines and fridges off the backs of lorries. To many of my American friends who didn't watch Top Gear back in the day, I guess, it's I should say a lorry is a large truck. It's a truck, semi-truck, delivery truck. But he wouldn't tell us about it. He used to say he was off on a business trip, I'll be gone about a month, darling, and he'd go out and do 30 days in jail. We didn't find out about this for a while, but he turned out all right at the end. He does seem like a pretty decent guy. In Mick Wall's definitive biography of Lemmy, he talks about the fact that he willingly offered to become Lemmy's stepfather, making Ian Kilmister into an Ian Willis, which he did remain known as for 10 years. But because he was Catholic and, Lemmy's mother was not his original wife that he had this child with, he had to write to the Vatican for dispensation. And they sent back notice that he could only marry Lemmy's mother through the Catholic Church if they had provided proof that Lemmy was illegitimate. Lemmy said, "There's a church for you to send a child through his life with a stigma." Wonderful people, the Catholic Church, very big on guilt. That's how they survive. He told them, "Excommunicate my ass." And they did. He wouldn't obey them. And they hate people that don't obey them. Sons of bitches. It's not religion. It's just politics and control. I do like that story for multiple reasons, but I also, it kind of ties in maybe with his motivation to name his first version of Motorhead Bastard instead of Motorhead until the manager Doug Smith talked him out of it. Experiences like this one and the notable fact that his absentee father, who abandoned him at 3 months old, was actually a chaplain in the Royal Air Force. Didn't do much for Lemmy's respect for religions, especially Christian ones. There would be a lot of anti-religion themes in his music as time would go on. In an interview, he'd say, "There's no divine being who's all-powerful, otherwise it wouldn't be this fucked up, would it? That was one of the first reactions I had to the church. My father was a vicar, I thought to myself, if you were a vicar in touch with God, how come him and my mother are so desperately unhappy that they had to break up, And how is it the Catholic Church says that I have to be declared illegitimate for you or her to marry a Catholic man, my stepfather, How could the church do that if they were in touch with God? So fuck God and fuck the devil and fuck the church too. I'm responsible for my actions. I don't need to hide behind nothing. The devil didn't make me do it. I did it, whatever I did." And I don't want to leave off and neglect speaking about his mother, who was quite an inspiration to Lemmy. He would say that he was mostly raised by his grandmother and his mother in the absence of any steady male parental figures. I think it's not uncommon for men of that era in England and maybe in other countries that fought in World War II as well. But culturally, the ones that became entertainers especially didn't grow up with a lot of trust of authority, not a lot of respect for men in high places in suits. But they also, or at least especially Lemmy, had a lot more respect for women. He talks about his mom was a TB nurse, he said, which is rotten fucking work because in those days it was like being on a terminal cancer ward. So she was more or less just seeing the patients on their way, and she saw tuberculosis babies being born. Apparently there were some real horrors. Tuberculosis does something weird to the chromosomes. She saw newborn babies with rudimentary feathers on them and another one born with scales. Eventually she left the job and worked for a time as a librarian, but then she stopped working for a while. I didn't quite understand the pressure she was under, and I figured we'd be all right. Later on, she was a bartender, but that was after she married my stepfather. That was from his own words from White Line Fever, the autobiography. So let's jump back to the stepfather. Lemmy is about 10-ish years old, and they move into his house in Benlech, Benllech, a seaside resort. He claims that was about that time he began to be known as Lemmy. He says it was a Welsh thing, I believe. I was very bad in school, being the only English kid out among 700 Welsh that was made for fun and profit, right? So I've always been Lemmy since I was around 10. I didn't always have the mustache. I've only had that since I was 11. But I did manage to entertain myself by stealing some gelignite. And rearranging the coastline of Anglesey. There was this construction company redoing all the drains in the village. They could only work in the summer because after that the weather got too cold. So they used to pack up around September or October, and they would stash all their supplies in these porta cabins. And around the end of October, the beginning of November, me and some friends would break into them. I mean, Jesus Christ, if you're a boy of about 10 or 11, it was like finding buried treasure. We found caps and overalls, gelignite and detonators and fuses, all kinds of wonderful shit. We would bite the detonator onto the fuse and shove it into the gelignite. Then we'd dig a hole in the sand on the beach, shove the contraption into it, twiddle the fuse out, and cover it up. We'd finish by putting a big rock on top, light the fuse, and run like bloody fuck. And boom, the stone would fly 50 feet in the air. It was great. Later, I'd find crowds of people standing there in the rain, looking at the damage and muttering, "What do you think? I don't know, aliens?" I had no idea what the village copper thought was going on, because he'd hear all these terrifying bangs, and he'd come out to the beach, and half the cliff had slid into the sea. About 2 miles of coastline was different when we were finished with it. Just innocent fun, right? School kids get up to all kinds of shit. And after all, why not? That's their job, isn't it? To piss off the elders and give them a cross to bear. Otherwise, what use are they? So there's a lot you can read about in Lemmy's autobiography, White Line Fever, and Mick Wall's definitive biography, Lemmy. When it comes to his youth, his first, teenage adventures, first jobs, first girlfriends, and first times playing guitar, becoming obsessed with rock and roll, and Little Richard, and various rock and rollers that had a huge impact on him. I'm not going to dwell on that right now. I would say read the books. There's a lot of information there, but I'm going to jump ahead to when he actually started playing professionally in a band called the Rockin' Vicars. And a vicar is, for other Americans like me, it's not a term we grew up hearing. Like, I guess it's a pastor or a priest of some kind. Anyway, they all wore collars, like priest's collars on stage for a while. They had a lot of more professional gigs. I think this is after. And if you double check me on this, call in, correct me. I believe this is after he was in a band called the Motown Sect. And they called themselves that, even though they weren't a Motown band. They wanted to get gigs. And Motown was very popular in sort of dance hall shows and stuff. So they would go up on stage and say, "How many James Brown fans are here?" And people would cheer. And then they go, "This song is for all you James Brown fans. It's by Chuck Berry, and it's called 1, 2, 3, Go." They'd start a Chuck Berry song that they already knew. That they didn't learn any new songs. They just changed the name of the band. And they did this until they got kicked out of a lot of places or told to never come back or that they would never work in that part of town again. And then they finally had to kind of break things off. But he went from there, I believe, to the Rockin' Vicars, which he actually logged quite a bit of time in. They did a little touring. They had a very, very professional sort of truck that they rode around the countryside in. They had a crazed roadie who drove for them. In one story, supposedly the leader of the band had the rest of the band get out of the truck just to prove how much sway he held over the mind of their truck driver. He ordered him to drive through a shop window, and the band watched as he did. Like a wedding boutique of some kind. Dresses and mannequins went flying everywhere. And he turned around and said, "See, I want you to understand and respect just how he will do anything for me, no matter what I say." I want to get into this sort of atmosphere at the time that they were performing in, that they were competing with the kind of bands that they were playing gigs with or going to see the gigs of. A lot of this is going to be straight from Lemmy's voice, or from his mouth, as it were, from the Mick Wall book. He talked about the band Sounds Incorporated, who had a saxophone player. He says he used to do a one-handed cartwheel while playing the saxophone without missing a breath. And Tony Newman on drums. The Blonde Bombshell ended up playing with Jeff Beck, and they backed Gene Vincent, and they backed PJ Proby. There were all sorts of characters then, like Rory Storm, who, if you've you've heard mentioned before if you listen to my Beatles episode. Rory Storm, who would climb up the scaffolding at the side of the stage and throw himself down while singing. He fell off at once and broke his fucking arm. Nobody cared. He just went to the next gig with a cast. And then he mentions a band called 4+1, featuring Keith West, who would go on to be in a band called Tomorrow. He said they were around for ages, very influential on the scene. They had a bass player called Bootsy, who was always going to jail for some reason. I'm assuming this is not Bootsy Collins we're talking about. But he also discusses seeing Junior Wood, bassist in Tomorrow, throw his bass guitar up in the air, catch it, and play the right note at exactly the same time the singer began singing. That was very, very big. A Fender Precision bass? That's not a lightweight object. So I thought, this guy is good. We used to go see these bands every time they came around. The place would be jammed. And this was without a record. Next, he started showing up regularly at gigs by a band called The Byrds. They were originally the Thunderbirds from West London. They dropped the word thunder from their name after Chris Farlow and the Thunderbirds got there first. This kind of feeds into a lot of those jokes in Spinal Tap when they talk about how they used to be called the Originals and they found out there was another band that had already existed called the Originals. So they became the New Originals. And then the Originals stopped using that name so that they could go back, but maybe they dropped the new from... All that stuff is in stories of these kind of bands in England at the time. Anyways, this band features the future Small Faces and Rolling Stones guitarist Ronnie Wood and bassist Kim Gardner, who years later, Lemmy would become friends with in Los Angeles, where Gardner had opened the Cat and Fiddle, aka the English pub, popular with other expat British musicians. This is me reading straight from Mick Wall's book right now. They specialized in covers of American classics, Chuck Berry, Howlin' Wolf, Bo Diddley, tons of Motown. By the time they got to play as far as Manchester, the Byrds were a brilliantly tight outfit. Lemmy loved the explosive mix of jittery mod guitars and drums and joyous Motown-style vocal harmonies that became the Byrds, again, not the American band, signature sound. They were a very big influence in my career, said Lemmy. An incredibly large influence in my career, really. They had 3 singles, and I used to play all of them, he told me proudly. They used to play stuff you'd never heard before, and they used to do a lot of their own stuff. Ronnie used to write a lot of songs, including their first single, You're On My Mind, on Decca Records. That was the last time Ronnie was a really good guitar player because his stuff with the Stones and Faces never approached it at all. He was powerful, and the look of them was excellent too. Ronnie in a 3-piece tweed herringbone suit on stage and a white Telecaster. And then very sharp moves and all that. One of the best gigs I ever saw was them and The Action. They were another great band. Lemmy goes on to talk about the fact that back then, you didn't need to be in the charts to be big on the club circuit. He said more even than a lot of chart bands because you were popular with everybody that went out there and knew you. Whereas if you just come out of nowhere with a chart record, it didn't necessarily mean they were going to like you in the clubs. Fucking Crispin St. Peter's, all them bozos. We go for the real stuff, bands that played 3-hour sets and knocked your fucking head off. He recalled with a glow hitching up to Preston to see the Byrds. They noticed us in the crowd. We told them we had nowhere to stay, so they let us sleep in the van. Can you imagine that happening now? It was the height of luxury as far as Lemmy was concerned, except for the fact that the doors would always come off the top end. He talks about the first time he ever saw Jimi Hendrix while he was still in the Rockin' Vickers. He said, it was the oddest tour I've ever seen. The Walker Brothers, Engelbert Humperdinck, Cat Stevens, Hendrix, and some local band. The Walker Brothers were as big as the Beatles at the time. People don't realize now. Massive. Talking more about Hendrix. I couldn't believe him, Nobody could believe him. Hendrix changed the way people play guitar forever. Nobody knew you could do that with a guitar. The big thing before that was Clapton. That was as high as you could get. But this guy was turning somersaults and playing. People have lost it now. These bands have fucking lost it. They think smashing up the equipment is a big show. Hendrix used to do a double somersault and come playing it behind his neck, fucking bite it. Fucking every fucking thing. He was playing it with his teeth. I watched him many nights and he wasn't pretending. Playing it with his fingers. He was playing it with his teeth. He used to fuck the amplifier and drag it around on the floor. Rory Gallagher got his act from there, lighting it on fire. Actually, I do have to sort of clear up a little bit of the timeline here, or not clear it up, but muddy it up some more. As I switch from the Mick Wall book back to Lemmy's autobiography, he's talking in his own words about the fact that the time he slept in the Byrds' van, he says he was still in the Motown sect, of whom you will hear more in a bit. But I think he's about to tell the story that I've already told, if I remember right. But he talks a bit about the whole fashion-oriented scene in England, music, how fast the fads would come and go. He said the mods were a very odd sort, at least in my estimation. They had short hair combed over to one side, kind of like John Kennedy, but with a rooster tail like Swatch at the back. And they wore trousers made of this very thin cord material with these bright print tropical-style jackets and two-tone shoes. The nearest American equivalent would be the Beach Boys, but we didn't have the surf thing. It was really more in town as far as England was concerned. And the mods used to wear eye makeup too, especially the boys. The crowd of people I was in disliked them, but in retrospect, it was no worse than what we were doing. I mean, we thought they were sissies, and they thought we were yobs, and, we were both right. He talks about meeting up with John Lord, who would later go on to be in Deep Purple and Whitesnake and Rainbow. But when I met him, he was playing with the Art Woods, who, funnily enough, were fronted by Art Wood. Even funnier, Art Wood was Ron Wood's brother. But hold on a moment. I'm going to read all this straight from Lemmy's book. There was this huge, great palace of a boozer called the Washington on the seafront in, I'm going to mispronounce this, sorry, Landudno. And they had rock shows in the upstairs ballroom. They started having jazz and blues nights. They had Graham Bond with Ginger Baker and Dick Hextall Smith. They had the Downliners sect, jazzman Alan Skidmore, and then one night, the Artwoods. So I was lounging about the place, staring at the exotic equipment, and I watched them play. Pretty good, I thought, from my lofty critic's perch in North Wales. Anyway, I was talking to John Lord after the show, and he and the band offered me a lift back to Colwyn Bay. I'm sure John's regretted that ever since. The poor fool gave me his address in West Drayton, near London, and about 3 weeks later, off I went. I mean, this impossibly huge star would probably have a huge mansion, and he would probably let me sleep in the servants' quarters and introduce me to other impossibly huge stars. By the way, the first letters of impossibly huge and star all capitalized in his book. With whom I would seek my fortune, etc. Alas for dreams. The address turned out to be a house on the council estate. I arrived about 3 a.m. and rang the knocker and banged on the bell. A sweet little old lady opened the door. Yes, who is it? It's me, I said. Lemmy from North Wales. Eh? John Lord will remember me. He gave me this address. Oh, no, dear. He's on tour in Denmark. Why hadn't I considered this possibility? I was young and dumb, that's why. Ah, I said. She looked at me. I looked at her. I said. Silence grew between us. Then she said something for which I will be eternally grateful. Star turn that she was. Oh, well, never mind, dear. You can sleep on the couch and we'll see in the morning. You don't get much of that in our brave new world. So I awoke to find Ron Wood with 3 of his mates hanging over me going, Oi, what you doing on my mom's sofa, eh? So she was Mrs. Wood, mother of Ron and Art, and John was living there. Coincidence, eh? I got to go to a Byrds gig that night and then went on to Sunbury-on-Thames, but more of that later. I don't know. We'll probably not get to the later part. As I said, there's a ton of great information in both these books about Lemmy's early years. Doesn't skimp on any of those bands he was in or the bands that he saw. I can't do it all justice on this episode, of course, because we got to get moving on. We got to get into some Motorhead stuff. We got to get into some Hawkwind stuff. Another distinction between the two books, I would say, is if you want the full Hawkwind story from as far as Lemmy's involvement and that part of his life, go for the Mick Wall book. Lemmy tells enough of his experience in Hawkwind to get the point across and how much he loved the band and how he said multiple times he would have stayed in that band forever if they had never kicked him out, and how he got kicked out for basically when they were going into Canada one time. He was caught with what they thought was cocaine. It was actually tested later and turned out to be some other stimulant that was actually legal at the time, some sort of amphetamine that wasn't outlawed yet, I guess. And they used this excuse to basically gang up on him, or at least enough of the band that didn't want him in the band anymore. So he's told the story many times in the books and in the movie about Lemmy titled Lemmy. about going home from that tour before the rest of them could get back home because they were finishing up without him, and having sex with 3 of the band members' girlfriends. Although he admits that one of them he had already been having sex with anyways. Let's talk about the roadieing for Hendrix part of his career. He has a friend, after this is a little later, he's been hanging out with the Byrds some more. He has a buddy named Neville Chesters who had worked with the Mersey Beats. He had met him in the Vickers when he was working for The Who, trying to put guitars back together after Pete Townsend had finished smashing them. He calls his buddy up, asks if he can stay on his floor for a while, and says, yes, come on over. He was working for the Jimi Hendrix Experience by then, and he had shared his flat with Noel Redding, the bass player, in Harrington Gardens in Kensington. The whole flat is full of these guitars in different degrees of disrepair and destruction that Neville was trying to put back together out of little bits, cannibalizing all these Rickenbackers to make whole guitars again. So he's trying to figure out where he's going to live after this, and Neville mentions that they are looking for a second roadie to assist him on the next Hendrix tour. 16 dates around Britain, starting with Royal Albert Hall on the 14th of November. So he gets hired on, Lemmy does, for £10 a week and all your meals and such. The tour has a band called The Move as well, who've made their own name in sort of those psychedelic and pre-psychedelic times. And the supporting act is called The Nice. Also touring with them is Pink Floyd, the Syd Barrett version of Pink Floyd, and someone named Amen Corner. These bands are getting 15 minutes each on the bill every night. So just the hits and get off stage. Great fun, Lemmy says. What quite an honor working for Hendrix. He says he was like a prince, a really, really good guy. Very old-fashioned, good manners. Get up when a lady enters the room. Pulling chairs out for chicks. Good manners are for free. I don't like anybody that doesn't have them. There's no reason. He said his job was generally humping, carrying. Neville would take care of the electronics. I just humped all Hendrix's gear. When he was playing, I'd watch him on stage from a chair in the wings. You could never tell how he did it. He loved to fuck off all the guitar players in the audience. Graham Nash, who was in the Hollies, would join Crosby, Stills, and Nash later, of course, used to sit backstage with his ear on the stacks all night. None of this glad handing you get backstage now with fucking canapes. In those days, people wanted to learn and improve. Even off stage, being around Hendrix was a lesson. He had his old Epiphone guitar. It was a 12-string, strung as a 6-string. And he used to stand up on a chair backstage and play it. Lemmy also mentions his stamina for groupies. And he says, if you wanted to see some athletic fucking, Jimmy was the boy for it. I'd never seen anything like it. There were always lines of chicks going nuts outside his dressing room. It was like, take a number and wait. He's told the story before of scoring acid for him and dope. He said, I'd get him 10 hits of acid, and he'd take 7 and give me 3. They say acid doesn't work 2 days in a row, but we found out if you double the dose, it does. He says everybody was tripped out on that Hendrix tour on acid. He said, I must have taken 1,000 trips. I only did it until 75. I stopped then. But I must have taken a lot of fucking trips. I mean, 10 tabs and a handful. If it fit in your hand and your mouth in them days, we just did it. To him at the time, he also talks about the fact that, they started putting speed and strychnine in and all sorts of stuff. So the stuff that people were doing later wasn't comparable to the kind of acid they were getting their hands on at the time. But it made you hard mentally, he says. Or it destroyed you. It's hero stuff, acid. No comment from me here about the kind of stuff that we got in the early 90s. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we would like you to join us for the next portion of the program in a completely different room. Please move from the foyer to the theater. Here, once you're all seated, we will discuss via musical demonstration the bass playing style of one Mr. Lemmy Kilmister, post Hawkwind, in the early days of Motorhead, on into the Hammersmith era of Motorhead, putting on display your host's very rudimentary bass-playing skills of his own. Enjoy. Now, I'm not much of a bassist, all right? But I can demonstrate what makes Lemmy's bass-playing style different from what you might say his peers were at the time. Actually, not his peers. I'm going to go with the mainstream rock examples that were recorded and very successful during the years that Lemmy's bass-playing style is first being recorded. I'm talking mid-'70s through 80, maybe, 1980, 81, 82. I'm going to do a little bit of Aerosmith, Led Zeppelin, Sex Pistols, and Ramones. Now, beyond those, there's plenty of different kinds of bass players. At the time, of course, I can't cover all of it, and I certainly can't demo the progressive 70s styles of Yes or King Crimson or Jethro Tull or Genesis. Those are off the charts, but they're there. If you want to get a good feel for what some of the audience was listening to, I would say check out some of those bass lines. I can't possibly replicate here, and because of obvious copyright issues, I can't just grab clips of those songs, let alone find the isolated bass tracks and put them here. But people in Britain and America and other countries that are doing drugs and listening to rock music that is bass guitar, not centric, but heavy, like that. When you notice the bass player standing out, a lot of progressive rock of the time would be sort of the thing that rock fans are judging a bass player's metal against. Ha ha ha. No pun intended. I mean, obviously, Geddy Lee from Rush is another one as well that you could put up in that sort of pantheon of what was making people perk up their ears when it came to bass players. But let's start with I won't say I'm playing John Paul Jones's parts, right? Let's say I'm going to do a John Paul Jones-esque bargain basement imitation here, because I'm just a guitar player with a Fender P bass plugged into my rig, and but I want to give you the feel for, like, when it comes to John Paul Jones, more of a, dare I say, Motown influence, hard rock, right? I know that's an abomination if you're a John Paul Jones fan, but I'm giving you the vibe, all right? Shut up. Now, let's go to a little Tom Hamilton on maybe like an Aerosmithy Toys in the Attic vibe, closer to what a heavy metal rhythm would probably end up being later on, the kind of bands that, I mean, when it comes to the Aerosmith influence, you're talking about Metallica early stuff as well as Mother Love Bone stuff, so they had far-reaching implications, rhythmically especially. A lot of folks don't talk about that. That's probably another story for another time. But Tom Hamilton, underrated rock, metal, and hard rock bassist for the 70s, 80s, 90s for sure. And this is me not doing him justice at all. Met him at a Costco once. Yeah, that was ham-fisted and not accurate, but I'm not Tom Hamilton. I'm not getting his money. Anyways, let's go to, let's say, a very famous Sex Pistols bass line. And now the Ramones are also known for some pretty simplistic bass lines. Dee Dee Ramone was, not exactly a piano student or a Juilliard graduate. But, by the time they started making records with one record with Phil Spector, they did at least go from something like this to the kind of thing that Dee would end up playing live to sort of replicate the horn parts in a song like Do You Remember Rock and Roll Radio, which is a more typical kind of boogie-woogie, old-school piano bass line like this. So there's two punk rock examples, two arena rock examples. Obviously, like I said, I'm not going to replicate the prog rock examples from the geniuses that were playing bass in bands like Yes and Rush and King Crimson and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But meanwhile, you did still have new wave happening, and the bass lines for some of those bands were pretty interesting, albeit played on a synthesizer. But there's a lot of them that were very successful that were just kind of going boop, 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 boop on the, low end of the keyboard. So I do all this just to bring to mind the atmosphere, the peer group, the kinds of people that are playing bass in successful rock bands. There's a lot of, we're talking about Motorhead now. This is not a successful mainstream rock band. We're talking about, someone who before Hawkwind played in a lot of bar bands, and the boogie woogie feel for a lot of those bluesy bar bands was more like this kind of thing. Whatever. La di da di da di dee da do da 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 da. Someone on the drums going. Those are the toms. It is not overkill. It is not, Ace of Spades. It is way drunker and stoneder than what Motorhead would be rhythmically. Rhythmically, Motorhead is definitely influenced by the amphetamines they were doing and their just attitude. People say that a lot with Motorhead, attitude. And I don't know how many people that really sort of translates well to, depending on your background and your musical experience and your social experience. But at that time in that era, we're talking about people that didn't fit in with the more, anarchic for anarchy's sake and playing poorly and loudly and getting in fights on stage punk bands, nor the more austere levels of musical, the heady musical rarefied air that a lot of metal bands, pretentiously wanted to stay within, or the progressive hard rock bands wanted to stay within. But Motorhead certainly had plenty of friends, plenty of other bands that had a attitude full of reckless abandon and musicianship. I'm talking more about your Thin Lizzies here. People that cared about lyrics and a little bit of poetry, a little bit of, cleverness when it comes to a turn of phrase in your lyrics, and good guitar playing and hooks and very competent, if not excellent rhythm sections. And still lots of attitude, still the kind of people on the microphone that might bust your ass, might knock your face in if you looked at them wrong or threw the wrong thing at them or got in their way. But anyways, to get back to the origins and get back to just two more examples of what bass playing styles were like, let's do like a little bit of Geezer Butler from Black Sabbath. He was doing things that sounded more like this. Again, for any of you bass players that are going, no, but he didn't play it with fake. I'm just a guitar player. Calm down. I'm only trying to replicate the basic vibe and the accents of the rhythms and the way they played, the way they emphasized things in the chosen phrasing. Now, one more example before I get into Lemmy. I want to go back to some Cliff Williams bass playing from AC/DC. Because you can't talk about late 70s hard rock without AC/DC. And, if you understand the genius of that band, and if you don't, we'll get into it in a future episode about Maximum Overdrive, you might know the glory and the splendor of Cliff Williams playing one note for, I think, like the first 2 minutes straight of Livewire. That's everything. While the guitars are like dun 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 tss, tss, dun dun, and the whole time he's doing that just like that. And that's what makes AC/DC confounding to lots of musicians. It's what makes them great in a lot of ways. That there's a lot of bass players that, if they haven't studied AC/DC and they get asked to play an AC/DC song, they don't realize how little they have to do to make the dynamics in those songs work. It's the movement is in the guitars, and I know lots of rock bands will say that, and people will say that about a lot of rock bands, but really, it's like the least amount of drum fills in any rock band that's successful. It's the least amount of bass movement in any bands that's successful. And people say that the guitars are minimalist, but the guitars are carrying all the momentum forward. Anyway, very much not Motorhead. And let me do one more example of AC/DC here. It's later AC/DC, or I guess, I don't know, Paleolithic AC/DC. You know what kind of a dirtbag I am when I say something from Highway to Hell is a later AC/DC. Not a snob about it. I'm just saying. To me, I think every AC/DC fan has their own timeline of what's new, what's old, what's middle ground. But anyways, Let's get back into Motorhead now. Let's compare that being the most moving and shaken sort of AC/DC type bass line from the late 70s and juxtapose everything we've sort of listened to and demonstrated up until now with Lemmy's bass playing style. I mean, if you could be Little Richard on a Rickenbacker bass guitar and do lots of speed and lots of LSD, this is naturally what would happen. Now, I'm going to play a bass tone that is different from the previous bass tones. All the previous bass examples have been played with the same settings, audio-wise, the same EQ, the same sort of compression, blah, 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 blah. I haven't changed anything. I haven't changed the knobs on the bass or the volume or the tone or any of that stuff. Now I have to turn on some distortion, but I want you to understand that the distortion doesn't have as much to do with the change in style that you're about to hear as the use of a droning low note underneath the higher notes that he plays and the percussive aspect of what he's doing in a constant throbbing way that these other hard rock bass practitioners do not employ. I'm not saying it's better. I'm not saying it's worse. I'm saying it's goddamn Motorhead is what it is. Wasn't that a delightful demonstration? Aren't you happy to have been so thoroughly educated by your lovely host in this manner? If so, please call in now. The 10th and 15th callers will receive a complimentary package of Farmer Mortimer's radish lozenges. Radishes have long been known as a very unique way to bring water into your body. And now we have dried them, dehydrated them, and turned them into lozenges. It's end of summer, early fall, 1967. Not in Lemmy's timeline where we last left things, obviously. But in the timeline of Frank Zappa, whose wife Gail is pregnant, very pregnant, with their first child-to-be. And then in the days before technology was available to let you know what genitalia the baby would be born with, a lot of parents would pick a couple of different names depending on the sex of the child. And as he's heading out the door, according to him, in the new Zappa documentary I just watched a couple of days ago, his wife Gail asks him before he leaves with the band and his suitcase and instruments and everything else, what about a name for the baby? He says, if it's a girl, name her Moon Unit. If it's a boy, name him Motorhead. That is how well entrenched the terminology was for American drug slang for someone who has gone over the top or off their rocker on speed, that Mr. Frank couldn't decide what would be funnier to name his first child. Obviously, it was a girl. Her name was Moon Unit, and we will get back to her during part of our upcoming episode about Valley Girl. Now let's talk naming Lemmy's new band. There's conflict between the story provided by his manager at the time, as presented by Mick Wall in the official bio that he wrote, and Lemmy's own storytelling. But the gist of it is really that after he's ousted from Hawkwind, he still has management of the same from the same office as Hawkwind, a guy named Doug something or other, who claims that, you know, as Lemmy will say, he wanted to call the band Bastard. He wanted to start his own version of the MC5. He said, if I could have started the British MC5 or just joined the MC5, and, you know, if I'd lived in Detroit, I would have done that. So he wanted a large band, not just a three-piece. But his management decided Lemmy was taking too long to decide what to do, so they put out a press release just saying, Lemmy Kilmister, formerly of Hawkwind, has started a new band, and it's called Motorhead instead of Bastard because, you know, they've decided you're never going to get on top of the pops with a name like Bastard. Their claim is, Mick Wall and their management's claim, is that Lemmy, he came up with a name because it was the last song he wrote for Hawkwind. It's a great tune. The Motorhead version of Motorhead's even better than the Hawkwind version of Motorhead. In my opinion, it's a lot faster. And really, the No Sleep Till Hammersmith version of Motorhead is my personal favorite. I think it's crystal pure, perfect Motorheadness. It's amazing. Oh my God. The way the bass starts out all by itself in that huge, huge room, and the sound of it and the percussiveness of it's amazing. Anyways, Lemmy does take credit for adding the umlaut in the, which if you're not, if you didn't take the one German class that I took in high school, the umlaut is the two little dots above the O, above a lot of vowels in German, but makes you pronounce them differently. U sound. He says, Lemmy is recorded in Mick Wall's book as saying, that was only, quote, to make it look mean, he said. No other reason. Like when Paul Newman in Slapshots asks the bus driver why he's hitting the bus with a hockey stick, and the bus driver says, to make it look mean. So they get a band together of a couple other guys. There's a guy named Larry Wallace, initially on guitar, who used to be in a band previously called Pink Fairies, and then a drummer named Lucas Fox, who had already played a bunch of shows in London with bands like Bloodwind Pig and Shagrat, who I'm not familiar with, but UFO I am, of course, familiar with. And UFO would be the band that would sort of eventually bring Michael Schenker, the guitarist, to some fame later, many years later. Well, I know. I take it back. What am I saying? I got my timelines all wrong. Michael Schenker, brother of Rudy Schenker, who was in the Scorpions. Anyways, let's not get derailed here. But they are in the studio making the first Motorhead record while, you know, kind of doing some gigs here and there. Billed as Lemmy's Motorhead, because Lemmy actually did have enough of a rock star name at the time. He was recognizable at the time, even though he'd only been in other people's bands up to this point. Now, there's a time during the recording of this first album that wouldn't see the light of day for at least 4 years, unbeknownst to the band, where the drummer just didn't really work out and had to, you know, be replaced in timely fashion while they knew his drums were still in the studio. And Lemmy and a young man about 2021 that he knows named Phil Taylor hang around a lot together dealing drugs to the Hells Angels. Not the American Hells Angels, but the British Hells Angels that have no official connection to the American club. They just use the name for their own. I'm sure that got sorted out legally in due course, but I don't really know that story and don't care to. But they hang out a lot, and young Phil kind of charms Lemmy, especially after one night of being up all evening. I'm not quite sure if this is in a house that they're sleeping in regularly or just someone else's house that they're partying in, but they are As the quote is that they were up all night together skating on ice. Early the next morning, there's a lot of commotion and a lot of noise outside in the garden in front of this house. And there's Phil Taylor, completely naked, bouncing all over the landscape and like knocking things over, jumping in and out of the bushes and screaming and hollering. And then all these curtains start pulling back from other windows around. And clearly people are waking up to this noise and trying to peek out there and see what's going on. What kind of crazy animal is causing such a ruckus? And finally, Phil stops moving around and making all this noise, looks at all the windows and the pairs of eyes staring at him with fright and feverishly, and just decides to stop what he's doing, throw his hands up in the air and screams, "It's all right! I'm on drugs!" Later that very day, Lemmy decides that this is the man that needs to try out for Motorhead as their new drummer, especially because Phil has a car and Lemmy does not have a car. So he tricks him into trying out for the band by asking him for a ride to the studio. This is about the time-ish where Lemmy claims there was no proper windscreen or windshield in the car. It had been busted out. So it's freezing cold to ride in. But Lemmy went and got himself a girlfriend that had a fur coat that would sit on his lap when he was in that car. Phil, in some interviews, claims that Lemmy's wrong. There was a windscreen. There was just no heater in the car. You can take your choice. Take your pick as to who you believe. But regardless, it turns out that young Phil Taylor is quite the drummer. They cajole him into playing along with some of the tracks they've already recorded, and the intent is to have him finish up the songs, fill in the empty holes where the drums aren't there, overdub some drums that were there that needed correcting or fixing, and they like him so much, and he's game for it, that what the hell? They decide, let's let him do the whole album if we can. There's a split in the narrative when it comes to one track on that first record that would eventually become On Parole. There are, from one side, they didn't do the track Lost Johnny, because in Lemmy's autobiography, he said that one was fine as it was. Maybe also Lemmy wanted the original drummer to get paid, and he wanted to leave one off. But in the Mick Wall book, it's stated that this last recording session for the song Lost Johnny was prevented by an arrest in London for being drunk and disorderly, and Phil was not able to get back to Rockfield, where the studio was, in time to make the last session. Now, when it comes to the guitars on that first Motorhead record, the original tracks did survive. They were processed, printed, mixed, mastered, etc., etc. Fast Eddie Clarke, who would be Motorhead's classic lineup guitarist, along with Phil on drums and Lemmy on bass and vocals, would join the band while they were still wrapping up the record, though, and while the gear was still in the studio, just kind of like Phil. Phil was working construction on a houseboat, and Eddie Clarke was sort of the supervisor on that crew, who really liked Phil. He thought he was a bit of a nut, clearly jacked up on various, amphetamous stimulant type things, but basically thought he was a super entertaining kid. And Phil comes to him and lets him know that he's in the studio with Lemmy, and they're going to need another guitar player to sort of finish things up with this album and go play some shows, because the guy that's there isn't really working out. The consensus is kind of that like Lemmy had burned out the other guys in the band originally, because he let them try to keep up with him when it came to speed and staying up for days and days and days on end, and they all kind of lost their minds. That's the story from both sides of both of these books. And I guess I should mention at this point, the various sort of things the sources I'm drawing from aren't just these two books. There's also the Motorhead Classic Albums video documentary for Ace of Spades. There's the Lemmy documentary, the very nicely produced one that came out in the early mid 2000 issues. I think maybe, I don't know, if it was between 05 and 08. or 2010, or I'm completely wrong. I don't care. It's right over there on my shelf. I've had it for years. I'm not going to go look at it. There's also a documentary called Guts and Glory, and there's a documentary called Motorhead Live Fast, Die Old. I can happily recommend all of these sources. And if you have any to recommend, I never get tired of learning about this band. So please call in now and tell me what other sources I should read, watch, and or listen to. Now, this bit about Fast Eddie Clarke auditioning, I'm going to read straight from Mick Wall's book, and I'm going to do a very poor imitation of Eddie's voice. Anyone that is from England that would like to murder me for doing this impression of his voice is welcome to come find me and cut me up into little pieces. But I've watched a lot of footage of him talking over and over and over again, and I can't help wanting to do it. So Phil decides Eddie should come in and audition. He forgot to tell Lemmy about this, supposedly. And Eddie says, I turn up, and Lemmy obviously has no clue what I'm doing there. But he was always very good at waffling through stuff like that. He adjusts very well, Lemmy. You never quite know that he didn't have a clue, or whether he did or not. He covered his tracks well. Still, Eddie didn't quite know what he was letting himself in for, not even when he discovered he would be expected to pay for the rehearsal room too that day. I actually paid for my own audition, which is quite funny. Less funny was the non-appearance of Larry Wallace. So that's the original guitarist we're talking about. When he finally showed up after 3 hours, because the pretense was they're going to both jam together, and Larry didn't show up until 3 hours late. Eddie was getting on so well jamming with Lemmy and Phil, Larry seemed to pick up on the atmosphere, plugged in to play just one number, and walked out again. That's more or less how Eddie remembers it anyway. Speaking to Lemmy years later, his memory was slightly different. Larry always said he wanted a 4-piece, so we arranged a rehearsal. Notice I'm not doing an impression. So we arranged a rehearsal with this other guitarist, Eddie Clarke. Then we had one rehearsal as a 4-piece, which went well, and Larry split immediately. It was just as well, really. Larry's a great guy to talk to, but he's not a great guy to work with. There's a lot of people like that around. Again, this is all from the pages of Mick Wall's book, and Mick Wall goes on to say, whatever the truth, Eddie left the rehearsals that day convinced he hadn't got the gig. I thought, oh, well, that's it, he said. Then the following Saturday, about 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm lying in bed comatose, and there's suddenly this banging on my front door. I go downstairs in my underpants, thinking, what the bloody hell is this, waking me up at this time of day? It was Lemmy, standing there with a leather jacket and a bullet belt in his hand. He just gave them to me, said, you've got the job, and walked off again. I just stood there in my underpants looking after him. It's worth mentioning here that Lemmy gave Eddie and Phil their nicknames, Phil the Animal Taylor, or Filthy Animal Taylor, and Fast Eddie Clarke. Those weren't their ideas, they were his ideas. And for on Lemmy's end of things, he just says, well, it's easier to remember someone's name if you give them a nickname, and it's more fun too. So there we go. Let's talk about some drugs now. A new recruit from the Melody Maker came around to interview the new band around this time. His name was Alan Jones, and recalls the first meeting with Lemmy as him being a mess of warts, whiskers, and loudly creaking leather. Lemmy's wearing a Second World War German helmet sprayed silver, quote, which he promptly turns upside down on the table between us. Inside the helmet, there's a bag full of amphetamine sulfate. He then produces a knife, plunges it into the toot. With an astonishingly steady hand for someone who looks like he has not slept since the earth cooled, he lifts the knife blade toward me, a miniature Matterhorn of sulfate at its end. Not too early for you, I hope, he says. This is about the time when they are being managed by a friend of theirs, a friend of Eddie Clarke's named English Frank, which is funny because they're all English. Frank, I guess, put up some money to keep the band going or get the band going because he decided he was going to get into the music business, and he sets up a tour for Motorhead and pays for it up front. But then the tour didn't make any actual money, and Frank is sort of freaking out about the lack of profit. He gives the account books to Doug, the manager of Hawkwind and Motorhead, to see if he can sort of figure out what went wrong. Doug recalls that Frank was a good guy. He'd done his best, but all through the accounts, there was plumbing written down as a category for expenses. Plumbing, and plumbing. I said, "What's plumbing?" And Frank goes, "You know what plumbing is, man." That was drugs. That was all the drugs that he spent his money or band money on. As mentioned previously, Lemmy at this point is quite the practiced taker of drugs and player of music, compared to a lot of the people he's sort of running around with or burning out, or who are burning out in his wake. He had spent a lot of time while he was in Hawkwind on, cocaine and mandrax and dexedrine, black beauties or black bombers by another name. Lots of acid that would, he talks about the acid in those days, as mentioned previously, being different than what came later. The kind of thing that would keep you talking to the trees in the park for 8 to 18 hours at a time. Sometimes the trees would win the argument, according to him. One great little story is I don't want to dwell too much on Hawkwind, but I'm going to go backwards a little bit for a couple of fun band stories. So there's one thing about the Rockin' Vickers I forgot to mention. So on my way back to the Rockin' Vickers, let's stop at Hawkwind. And they've done things like played Wembley Stadium when his trumpet player is on stage wearing a witch's hat and I think no other clothes, attacking him with a sword while he's playing bass. And Lemmy's hitting the guy in the head with the bass while trying to keep playing the song. That's not the weirdest thing that ever happened on the stage with Hawkwind by a mile. But at one point, he'd been up for a long time. Let's see if I can let's see where the story starts with the drugs. Oh yeah. Him and his buddy in the band, Dick Mick, that's his drug buddy and his best friend in the band, I think, have been up for 3 days on dexedrine. Then they got paranoid, took some downers, which was mandrax, and thought it wasn't very interesting because it calmed us down too much. So we took some acid, and then we took some mescaline to make it more colorful. It started getting a bit freaky, so we took a couple more mandrax, and then we took some more speed because we got too slowed down again. Then we went to the Roundhouse, which is a venue that they were playing. Dick Mick was driving, and he was really interested in the side of the road, so he kept steering over to look at it. Finally, we got there and walked in the dressing room, and it was full of smoke. Everyone was smoking dope. This is all, by the way, from White Line Fever, Lemmy's autobiography. So we sat there for a while, and somebody came in with some cocaine, and we had some of that. And then some black bombers arrived, so we each had 8 of them. Those are uppers. Oh, yeah, and we took some more acid as well. By the time we got to the stage, me and Dick Mick were like boards. "Fucking hell, Mick," I said, "I can't move. Can you?" "No," he replied. "It's great, isn't it?" And this is the part that I had actually heard him tell verbally in the Live Fast, Die Old BBC documentary, I believe it was, talking about drug stories. He said, he got to the stage, and the roadies hung his bass on him, and he says, "The roadies hooked our boot heels onto the back of the stage and pushed us up, and they strapped my bass on me." "Right, okay," I said. "Which way is the audience, man?" "That way." "How far?" 10 yards. So I stepped up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right. Hit it. And that was one of the best live gigs we ever taped. The jamming between me and Brock was great, but I never saw the audience. We got Silver Machine, our only hit, and a number 2 at that from that gig. My vocals wound up on the recording, even though Bob sang it at the show. Bob wasn't on that night, and he sounded horrible, so everybody tried overdubbing it later, and I was the only one who sang it right. If you're like me and you like a lot of fun, wacky stories about fun, wacky individuals doing fun, wacky things, especially under the influence of chemicals, I would say check out the Hawkwind section of Lemmy's autobiography for sure. Of course, I recommend both these books anyway, and I will do so throughout the entirety of this recording. But I forgot to mention probably one of my favorite stories that Lemmy tells about being in the Rockin' Vickers, and he wasn't even there for the story when it actually happened. It happened to their guitar player, Ken, who had a Mini Cooper racing model that was the apple of his eye. And now I'm going to go into Lemmy's book directly and read straight off the page. but he couldn't get the wire wheels, which were very hard to come by. He was driving down the road once when this other Mini Cooper overtook him like a bat out of hell. As he came round the next roundabout, he saw it upside down, all smashed up with the wheels still spinning, and the guy hanging out of it unconscious, covered in blood. And Ken thought, ooh, fucking unconscious, is he? Took the fucking wheels off, drove them back to a farm, and hid them in a haystack. Then he called the police and ran back to the roundabout, and this cop was standing there saying, look at that. Some bastard stole his fucking wheels. Ken nodded and said, aye, there's some cunts around. That's the sort of people the Rocking Vickers were, in a nutshell. Ah, great stuff. I'm sure a lot of you are very disappointed that was my favorite story from the Rocking Vickers. I'm sure you were expecting something much bigger, but I don't care. It was just so petty and so insignificant and hilarious at the same time. I couldn't overlook it. I couldn't let this go by. Like I said, a lot of stories like that, a lot of wild personalities that populate the early years of Lemmy's career. And even when he gets into talking about Motorhead proper, there's still wacky stories about various engineers and producers and managers and other bands they played with. So he's just a great storyteller. Not surprisingly, he read a lot. Apparently, P.G. Wodehouse was one of his favorites to read all the time on the bus. Now, because he's the second English hero of mine that was obsessed with P.G. Wodehouse, I'm going to have to track that stuff down. We don't get that. We didn't have to read that stuff in school in America, obviously. So a quick detour again, now that I've broken down sort of some of the sources I'm drawing from and what I'm pulling from. If you're a huge Motorhead fan and you're listening to this because, God damn it, it's the only fucking podcast you could find about Motorhead, especially one that's as long as this, and you're going, I'm not learning anything. I already knew everything that this little man is talking about. This little pudgy man with his hairy belly. All right, you don't know what I look like necessarily, but that's what I look like. I would challenge you to then come to my rescue. If you listened to the Airheads episode, the Watch-a-Long Commentary episode with myself and Dan Tyson, you would know that I am stuck. I am stymied. I am trapped in my running around in a circle over one little fact, and that is the origin of the phrase Lemmy is God. Now, Clapton is God was graffiti that started being seen on walls around the time that Eric Clapton joined John Mayall's Blues Breakers and started playing shows with them. Years later, Lemmy is God became a thing, a catchphrase in metal circles. As I explained on that Airheads episode, the earliest I can trace it back is to like an 80s, oh God, it must be an 88, 89 book called Teenage Wasteland by one journalist who traveled to sort of a small town in middle America during a time when there was a satanic panic going on in the 80s and concern over heavy metal youth in America committing suicide. It's a whole thing. I read that in high school. The defining moment when she earned the trust of this group of teenagers, these metalheads she wanted to hang around with and record the conversations of and talk to, was when one of them saw her Ace of Spades ring on her finger. And that was when they realized they're dealing with someone that's not the average dickweed from the East Coast or the West Coast that's trying to exploit them for another story about depression and suicide and heavy metal and satanic worship. And they're like, oh my God, you like Motorhead? And she goes, oh yeah, I mean, Lemmy is God, obviously. And that's when she was brought into their social circle. And she hung out with them for, I think it was a couple of weeks before she had to go back home and publish her story, which became her book, Teenage Wasteland. It was name-checked more than once in the book, The Frayed Ends of Metal, which was the first Metallica biography that I ever read in the early 90s. It was definitely an unofficial one. If I read it now, it probably is full of padding. It's probably full of language that just sort of fills out pages and doesn't give you a lot of information. But that author wouldn't be the first, much like, anyways, a bunch of guys that I'll get into on other episodes. what I'm saying is, if you feel like you know everything about Motorhead, please email me if you know the earliest incidents or the origins of Lemmy is God. As the joke was in the movie Airheads, a lot of Americans think that's where it came from. I only because of Teenage Wasteland, the book written by Donna Gaines, had to look it up. She's not one of the usual names that pop up in rock and roll, history books. She wrote Teenage Wasteland. I guess that came out later than I thought, like 91-ish. But she also wrote Why the Ramones Matter, A Misfits Manifesto, The Spiritual Journey of a Rock and Roll Heart. Anyways, sorry, I'm trying to stop saying anyways. But she wrote for a lot of magazines, mostly it looks like. And then some scholarly collections, journals, and textbooks. She's a sociologist, journalist, and New York State licensed master social worker, and taught at Barnard College of Columbia University. So good for her. Anyways, as I've said, her book, Teenage Wasteland, published around 1990, but she started writing it, I think, after 1987. So if you have stories or photographic evidence or any magazine articles you can point me to that talk about where people and when people started saying Lemmy is God for the first time, that's what I need from you. Email those details to me at justtheworstever@gmail.com or call in now. So it's not easy to keep all the record label stuff straight. The best understanding I have of things is that Stiff Records was the original label that was going to put out what became, or what was supposed to be titled, On Parole. And they stuffed it, they didn't like it, or they didn't think it fit in with the image of the other bands they had that now were suddenly doing better than they expected. And Motorhead wasn't expected to do as well as, let's say, Elvis Costello. And they didn't look like Elvis Costello or the Police. Granted, this is like 1975, 76 we're talking about. I don't even know if the Police were making records then. I'm not going to look it up. But this does bring us around to the whole image thing and the longevity of someone like Lemmy and a band like Motorhead. It is worth remembering that he was playing very aggressive music with a spaced out hippie freak rock band like Hawkwind. Had a greasy, long-haired motorcycle jacket image during the earlier years of Motorhead when things were cleaning up and getting brightly colored when it came to hair and fashion, and then would influence a lot of speed metal and thrash metal, while he continued to state that Motorhead played rock and roll music. And then in the 90s, those speed metal and thrash metal proteges of his would slow down a lot and get very commercial, or as commercial as they could get away with, while Lemmy and Motorhead at that time got faster, tuned down lower, wrote more aggressive metal music, and still called themselves a rock and roll band. And kept on going until they died, basically playing louder, faster, heavier than bands that had come after them and been influenced by them and given life by them, quite frankly. But we'll get maybe into some of that later. So while Stiff Records buries On Parole for the next few years until, let's say, Overkill comes out and there's enough money being made by Motorhead that they decide to cash in on it, Motorhead does get signed to Chiswick Records, and after playing a bunch of shows together with the Phil Taylor and Eddie Clark lineup, they get in a lot of fist fights, admittedly, to hear them tell it, a lot of fun ones, a lot of crazy ones. Lemmy has stories of watching Phil and Eddie like beating the crap out of each other in like a hotel lobby while he's having a drink at a table, and like they stumble into an elevator that ding, doors close, goes upstairs, and they're still inside fighting. Eddie Clark talks about having to beg Phil Taylor not to punch producers in the face. But all three of them are used to physical violence enough at shows and out in the pubs and things that this is sort of par for the course. This is standard operating procedure, and there's really no hard feelings at this time about these sort of scuffles. You know, there's stories of them and their road crew jumping into the crowd at a show where a group of rampaging teddy boys had appeared at the, crashing gates at lots of long-haired rock shows in the late 70s, and whatever the dates were in the late 70s. I'm not saying throughout the late 70s. I'm saying this particular, let's say, couple of weeks worth of time. And they show up, they crash the gates, they barrel through the doors, they start beating up on these, long-haired motorcycle jacket wearing Motorhead fans, and Motorhead and their road crew jump off the stage and start beating up the Teddy Boys to defend their own crowd. And they do it effectively enough that they send the greasy thugs away and go back up on stage to a standing ovation and then play a whole concert. And because they were rough and they were loud and they were fast and aggressive musicians and not too arty-farty or precious about their musical abilities, they got along well with a lot of punk bands they ended up playing with, especially forming a lifelong friendship with the guys in The Damned. There's a show in particular that Lemmy recalls at the Roundhouse in '79 when they appeared in between The Damned and a band called The Adverts, who I'm not familiar with. Lemmy says, "The Damned got bottles thrown at them by our fans. We got bottles thrown at us by their fans. And the Adverts got bottles thrown at them by everybody. Great fun." But the band is getting worn out. They're not making much money, and they're having a hard time keeping it together. They're dealing drugs to make ends meet. At various times might be taking on odd jobs, things like that in between shows. And it's getting so bad that they talk about breaking up. So they agree that this next show will be their final show at the Marquee Club. And Eddie Clark suggests, well, why don't we at least record the set so we have something to walk away with, so we have some document of what we've accomplished. And the price that they are given as an estimate to record this show is $500. The band didn't even have $500 between the three of them at that time, even with management on their side. So they turn to an associate of theirs named Ted Carroll, who suggests, why don't you play the live show and then come into the studio and I'll record a single. They decide to do this, and what ends up happening is they just record their entire live set that they had just played the Marquee Club, and it becomes their first quasi-official album, Motorhead. They were supposed to put this out with Chiswick Records. I believe that is historically who did put it out, but the recording of this got them enough notoriety that they then transitioned into another deal with Bronze Records, who would put out the next three and what is mostly thought of as the official classic first three real Motorhead albums. But one small victory does come out of this release of the first Motorhead record, and that's accompanied with a single of a cover of Louie Louie. It makes it all the way to number 73 on the British Billboard charts. And this is very important because if you're in the top 75, you qualify to go on Top of the Pops, the live music sort of hit-making recording star television program of the time. Though it's not really live, it's, pre-recorded stuff, bands miming it. If you ever saw the Queen movie, Bohemian Rhapsody, you see there's a little to-do about that in one scene. And also, I highly recommend the History Buffs episode on YouTube that covers why that was a bunch of BS. Not that Queen had to record a live performance with backing tracks, but because it's impossible for anyone to get away with doing it live effectively, as can be seen by some truly, truly terrible live mixing done for, who is it? The band that did Blue Monday. New Order. I'm sure I'll get to them in a future episode as I get deeper into the new wave stuff. But back to Motorhead, they get to go on top of the Pops at a time when Eddie Clarke is still working construction. He's working on a house or a houseboat or something. I think this is after the houseboat job that he had where he met Phil Taylor. And he actually asks the people that own the house he's working on if he can turn on the television because he's about to be on in 5 minutes. So for the next two records, they get a producer named Jimmy Miller. He records Overkill and Bomber and is never asked back to work with Motorhead again after that. He was, according to them, in much worse shape than the band themselves, often showing up 5 hours late with crazy made-up stories about why, excuses every single time. He would show up to the studio in slippers and a house coat and, pass out at the mixing desk every now and then. After this couple of Motorhead records, he would do the Plasmatics album in 1980, and then there'd be nothing on his to-do list until 1991 when he recorded Screamadelica by Primal Scream, and then that's it. At least according to what I can find out about the guy. If you know more than me, call in right now and we will correct the record immediately. And it's around the time of these first couple of records that Motorhead gets a reputation in the papers, as it were, as being the worst band in the world by New Music Express. And over in Sounds magazine, there was a article titled, "If We Move Next Door to You, Your Lawn Will Die." Let's read some other press clippings from this time period here. This one's titled Motorheadache by David Lewis. Review Motorhead Bombers, misspelled name of the album. Play it loud, that's the Motorhead message. Never mind the quality or the neat production effects because there aren't any. Just play it loud and watch your stereo disintegrate before your very eyes. This is music to start the neighbors packing. Music for the kind of people who think sticking their head inside a bass bin is a subtle enhancement of the sound quality. Play it loud. How can anyone be objective about a record like this? What points of musical merit can you possibly find in an album that makes a Sham 69 song sound like a symphony? Personally, by the middle of side 2, I was simply numbed, brainwashed, rather than bludgeoned into submission by the monodimensional repetitiveness of it all. Rather like the Chinese water torture with falling bricks instead of drops of moisture hitting my brow. Granted, this is an aside by your narrator. We're talking about albums in the late 70s. These are not very long records, right? And these are fast songs. So getting to the middle of side 2 doesn't take you very long, is what I'm saying. This is before the 90s and the compact discs and the 16 tracks of 1 hour's worth of music. Back to the review. Look, I'm as much a sucker for the Gonzoid Moon Stomp as the next denim jacket, but you've got to have some sense of style. The charging rhino approach is all very well, but it helps to balance out the megawatts with at least some attempt at dynamics. Some change of pace and attitude occasionally, but as Lemmy bellows out during the title track, we aim to please, bring you to your knees, and he means to keep you there. Titles like Dead Men Tell No Tales, Sweet Revenge, Stone Dead Forever, and all the aces tell their own chest-beating tale. Or rather, they have to because you can't understand a word that Lemmy's yelling on about. All right, so his singing... I can't maintain an accent of any kind for this long. I'm probably slipping into something Australian now, so I'm going to stop. Going back to my American voice. All right, so his singing is hardly a thing of great beauty. But his fang-bearing growl is as much an integral part of the Motorhead napalm attack as his thrumming bass, filthy Phil Taylor's jackhammer drums, and Eddie's sandblasted guitar. Here, Lemmy's voice is buried in echo and stuffed awkwardly back in the mix, resulting in positively the worst studio sound I've heard since the Heartbreakers' LAMF. And we're not talking about Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers there. That's your narrator speaking, not the writer. Frankly, the thundering roar of a herd of rogue elephants would equal this album's subtlety quotient. With all the finesse of a hobnail in the groin, this is strictly music to perform lobotomies to, guaranteed to stun birds in mid-flight, kill all known germs, and reduce anyone over the age of 35 to a gibbering dementia. Remember, play it loud. To back up a bit from before Bomber and Overkill, I should not neglect to mention the time that Phil Taylor punched somebody so hard that he jammed one or two of his knuckles back into his hand in such a manner that it made it impossible for him to hold a drumstick in that hand right before a tour. So they had their drum tech, Bob's, gaffer tape a drumstick to that hand every night before every show, except for a couple of nights where the gig was so good that Phil refused to untape his hand because he didn't want to change anything. Years later, not too many years later, I think it's actually maybe only a year later, they ended up getting in a fist fight, Phil and Bob's, that was so much more extreme. Phil, what was it? He dislocated his wrist? Oh no, he broke his wrist. So so with that, Bob's got fired. Let's talk some more about Phil. It's not that Motorhead invented double bass drumming, although it sometimes seems like it. Certainly when it comes to the more, I'll say, modern, in quotes, influence, meaning from 1980 on out, on metal drumming, I would say Motorhead is one of the bigger influencers, but you could pair them up with Venom pretty nicely when it comes to the proliferation of double bass drumming in metal, especially speed, thrash, and extreme metal, death metal, everything that kind of came after Motorhead, essentially. Double bass is what you hear at the beginning of the song Overkill. And hard rock drummers had been playing kits with two bass drums for quite a while. It's not the first time this had been done, but it is the first time it had been popularized in a way that sounded so consistent and so insistent, so continuous. Ginger Baker, when he was in Cream in the late 60s, had two bass drums on his kit, but they were different sizes, meaning one was a deeper tone and one was a higher tone, two different notes. For those of you that were not in symphonic band or marching band in school or don't play with drummers very often or know how drums are tuned, they are actually all tuned to specific pitches so that a drum kit, when you play the whole thing, sounds in harmony with itself, as it were. And if you were to play a Motorhead-style drum pattern on the kick drums with one bass drum being tuned differently than the other, it might sound a little something like this abomination you're about to hear right now. Not good. Not good at all. Now, is this a drummer playing two kick drums live? No. This is a recording of one kick drum and then me having electronically clicked my mouse for another kick drum. It's terribly out of time with it. But you understand what I mean when I say that would be impossible to listen to for an entire song. Other guys that use kick drums, double bass drums, before Motorhead came along and popularized it, of course, were Deep Purple would do it on Fireball, but the second bass drum would be added right before the song and then taken away. In Led Zeppelin, John Bonham wanted to play two kick drums, but when Jimmy Page heard how deft he was on the kick pedal with only one drum, he flat out refused to let John Bonham play live or record with two because it just sounded much more impressive with him doing it with one foot. That is one of the reasons why he loved hanging out with Bill Ward of Black Sabbath when he wasn't busy working with Led Zeppelin, because he got to jam out on Bill Ward's double bass kit and gripe about the fact that he couldn't do the same thing in his own band. Still, when all of these legendary drummers were doing really impressive maneuvers on kick drums or double kick drums, it was more sporadic. It was more rapid fire bursts and for dynamics and really explosive fills and things like that. Not the basis of an entire song like Overkill would be, and then Ace of Spades would be, and a lot of other songs in Motorhead's catalog would eventually be. According to one interview I saw with Phil Taylor, he was merely getting both of his legs warmed up evenly by playing both drums back and forth. And the band started warming up their instruments, playing in E, and Phil suggested they keep riffing on the figure he was playing on the drums, and that became Overkill. Of course, Motorhead's most legendary album is Ace of Spades. If you haven't heard it, stop this right now, go listen to it, or go listen to No Sleep Till Hammersmith. I will probably finish this episode with my recommendations for Motorhead songs to check out if you aren't well versed in their catalog. But I also would recommend checking out the Classic Albums documentary on the making of Ace of Spades if you want to learn more about it. Hear them isolate the tracks that have recordings of them tap dancing with boots on, I guess, or cowboy boots or something, and the spoons being played in the middle of the song Ace of Spades. And you get to really, watch Lemmy and Phil laugh it up, share a lot of jokes, and then Fast Eddie Clarke give his own impressions of the experience at the time, all alone, apparently not wanting to associate with the other two, or maybe not just being able to schedule the right time. I don't know what he was busy doing. I don't have a lot to say about Fast Eddie Clarke because he's probably the least loud and talkative of the three. And his guitar style, I don't think, is noted as giving someone else their inspiration to play guitar a certain way. I don't think that's a slam against him. I think that he was no virtuoso, but he was a great hard rock and blues-based guitarist of the time. He's not Ritchie Blackmore. He's not Jimi Hendrix, but he also wasn't part of a band like Judas Priest or Iron Maiden either. There's just something he did at that time that was perfect for Motorhead. And I think his contributions to the songwriting should definitely be appreciated, and his contribution to their stage persona, their stage presence, I guess, should definitely be respected very, very highly. But personality-wise, he has a lot of clashes with Phil and with Lemmy. So I don't think that he gets to tell his story as often as those two do, or at least when you read the books and you read the interviews, a lot of his contributions tend to be moaning and griping. So I'll get deeper into his side of the story when we get past some of the stuff with the Plasmatics and with the Girl School and with No Sleep Till Hammersmith and then his departure. But I want to get back to Ace of Spades. The level of activity with Motorhead on these first three records, the recording, the touring, it's very fast-paced, and there's not a lot of looking back with rose-colored glasses and telling long stories. This isn't the making of a Led Zeppelin record. This isn't the making of the Beatles record with George R. R. Martin. Excuse me. George R. Martin is the author of Game of Thrones with George Martin. This isn't, there's no stories about how they came up with the specific sound of one particular instrument on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, is what I'm saying. All right. And Lemmy certainly doesn't have a lot of love for looking back and extrapolating on a lot of details unless it's more fun stories of wacky things that were happening at the time. So to that effect, I want to read a little bit straight out of his book again, White Line Fever, about this era. Our Ace Up Your Sleeve tour that fall was fucking mammoth. We barreled through all of Great Britain with the bomber rig, the Overkill backdrop with its flashing eyes, and on a couple of the earlier shows, we also had these lighting tubes forming a gigantic Ace of Spades playing card. The latter didn't last very long. It was a bit on the fragile side, and I believe it met an untimely demise. It was around about this time of the tour that our old label, Chiswick, released Beer Drinkers EP, the leftovers from the Motorhead England album sessions. The record charted, peaking at 43, and although we didn't see any big monetary returns, it was good for us. Anything's good that gets the name around, We finished the Ace Up Your Sleeve tour with 4 nights at the Hammersmith Odeon, and then an after-show Christmas party was thrown for us at the Clarendon Hotel. There were some fire-eating strippers there, all good, wholesome English fun. I don't know where they came from. It was some publicity-type scheme. If it had been somebody else's party, I probably would have enjoyed it, but as I said earlier, I hate those things if I have to be involved. It's terrible because you've just come off stage and you're knackered. The last thing you want to do is go to some fucking room upstairs at a boozer and be sociable. I mean, who needs it? After a gig, I prefer to get laid immediately, if possible, as you may have gathered. I like to go get one-on-one with a chick and just go someplace with her. I don't really mind where, a club or the back of the bus or wherever, One time I vanished with this chick right out the side door of Hammersmith Odeon right after our gig. Her name was Debbie, and she used to be a page 3 girl in the Sun. Aside from your narrator, I assume a page 3 girl in the Sun is an escort. The Sun's like sort of a is it a daily news or a weekly news magazine, a tabloid of some kind? Unless she's a reporter for The Sun and she had a column on page 3, I don't know. But I'm thinking of like the back pages of American weekly free newsletters and magazines that always have, well, I don't know if they do anymore. I haven't been a young man for a while that lived in the city and picked up those newspapers, but I digress. I walked off stage and gave the guitar to the roadie. Debbie was standing there, so I grabbed her and we immediately nipped out the door, joining the crowd that was walking away from my own gig. There I was in the middle of all these people walking down the road. A couple of them looked. That's Lemmy. No, it's not. Can't be. Forget it. Can't be him. They couldn't believe I was out that quick, so nobody asked me for an autograph. Nothing. It was really funny. I'd fooled them. Stonewalled them. In late December, we popped over to Ireland to do a few more dates. That's where Filthy broke his neck. It was in Belfast after a gig, and he was on a staircase playing Who Can Lift Each Other Up the Highest with a large Irishman. The Irishman lifted Phil up the highest and, at the same time, took a step back to admire his work into thin air. Then went backwards down the staircase, with Phil flying, and he landed on the back of his neck. We went over to them. The other guy got up, but Phil didn't. I said to him, "Come on, man." With stark terror in his eyes, he looked up at me. "I can't fucking move." We took him to a hospital in Falls Road. Keep in mind, this was Belfast on a Saturday night, and Falls Road is a Catholic area. Jesus Christ, you know. There were fucking bullets going by. This is, again, another American thing. I would not have guessed that would be a standard thing on a Saturday night in the early 80s, not knowing what that living there was like. But I understand what he's saying. I know a general American's history of, quote unquote, the Troubles, but you know, not for any help from my public school upbringing. Anyways, we went into this hospital, past the gunshot wounds and the bomb blast wounds, and they took him in. They had him braced on a table with his head propped up so he couldn't move. Well, he couldn't move it anyway. "I'm dying for a piss," he moaned as he was laying there. When he said that, our tour manager, Mickey, grabbed me and pulled me out the door. "What's the matter?" I wanted to know. As we were just through the threshold, we heard a nurse saying, "I'll just put this catheter in here, Mr. Taylor." Then, as the doors closed, "Ah, you bastard!" "I just wanted to get out of there before the screaming started," said Mickey. I suppose Phil had assumed they were going to somehow walk him into the toilet. Let him have a piss there and bring him back. He was lucky. He could have been paralyzed forever. Finally, Filthy emerged wearing this huge brace on his neck. I cut a bow tie out of black gaffer tape and stuck it to the front so he looked like a Spanish waiter with a goiter. Phil's done lots of other stuff besides that. We were going to do a book called Hospitals I Have Known Across Europe by Phil Taylor, a guide of European emergency rooms, you know. He's not real graceful, you see. Now, it's around this time that they are playing shows with a band called Girl School, and they decide to record a little EP together called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And they're billed as Motorhead Girl Schools. There's some great photos of this with them all dressed up in gangster gear. And they did a performance of a cover of Johnny Kidd and the Pirates' Please Don't Touch, which is an awesome rock and roll song that I think they do a little better than the original, but the original's worth checking out. It's fantastic to watch the footage of this on Top of the Pops. You get to see Girl School and Motorhead on stage together. Phil was still injured. He didn't record any drums for this little collaboration. Their drummer in Girl School did the recording of cover of Motorhead's Bomber. And then Motorhead covers Emergency by Girl School with Girl School's drummer. Her name was Denise DeFort. And they made Eddie Clark do the vocals on that one. But check out the footage of them playing together on Top of the Pops. I am very biased, but I find it to be one of the most heartwarming things I've ever seen in rock and roll. It's just so cool because it's so fun and casual, and it's these two bands just sharing the stage together and trading guitar solos back and forth and singing an old 50s tune. I've forced at least one other band to cover this for my own amusement with me and band I'm in. With a female singer, and we did the whole back and forth vocals and stuff. It's really cool. It's a fun song. Check it out. It's also around this time that Motorhead puts out their first real live album and gets their first #1 hit with it. No Sleep Till Hammersmith is a live recording of a show with Hammersmith Odeon towards the end of their Ace Up Your Sleeve tour. It is amazing sounding, and I think it captures the best sound of Motorhead if you want to introduce someone to the band, because it has such a great live tone. It's dirty, it's filthy, but you can still hear Lemmy's voice really well. Also, it just encapsulates some of the best tracks from their first 3 albums. It's a great time capsule for that band right before things started breaking apart with them. The title came from the fact that one of the truckers on that tour actually had it painted on the side of their truck. No Sleep Till Hammersmith, because they had 52 gigs on the tour and only 2 days off the whole time. So it became their motto. The album would go to #1 in England while Motorhead was in America opening for Ozzy Osbourne on the Blizzard of Oz tour, being booed or catcalled or made fun of by American heavy metal fans. But that tour would cement a lifelong friendship between Ozzy Osbourne and Lemmy. It's also during this era that they get to the reputation for being the loudest band there is. Even AC/DC at one point would say in an interview that the only band they've experienced that was louder than them was Motorhead. Bon Scott would say, "I like Lemmy because he's straightforward. He shakes your hand, looks you in the eye, and tells you what's on his mind. I'm sure we'd work well together. There'd be the occasional punch-up, but then we'd go to the bar, have a few, and all will be forgotten." There's stories from this era of Motorhead's PA system and amplifiers draining the power out of a whole substation or of some sort, frying the electricity in a couple of city blocks because of the current draw, and someone calling the police 12 miles away from an open-air venue because he couldn't hear his TV, things like that. All the stuff that Spinal Tap would basically use in their comedy. Speaking of comedy, they were good friends with the boys at they would become good friends with the boys in The Young Ones and Bad News, which was a sort of fake British heavy metal band that I believe came out before Spinal Tap and was big in the UK before Spinal Tap was a thing. They would end up using Lemmy as an actor in their movie Eat the Rich, and Motorhead would write and record a song called Eat the Rich specifically for the soundtrack and then put it out on their own later on. But it's fun to watch, since I mentioned Top of the Pops a few times, it's fun to watch Motorhead on the Young Ones episode. It's titled Bambi. And they just show up apropos of nothing in the living room of these 4 college kids that are the main focal point of the TV show. It's a wonderful show if you like really madcap early 80s English humor. It's very random. It's very silly. It's slapsticky and very well written. It's a hoot. It's been one of my favorite sort of comedy shows for a long, long time, but I can't really recommend it to a lot of people. It's really wacky and out there. But the main thing about the Motorhead appearance on it, besides it being Phil Taylor's last time in the band for quite a while until he comes back around in the early 90s, I think it is that there are at this point 2 guitars. I'm skipping ahead in the timeline a bit. We're going to bounce around a lot now. There's two guitarists in the band. It's not Fast Eddie Clarke anymore. He's gone. It's Phil Campbell and Wurzel, who would both be the Motorhead guitarists for the remainder of the 80s at that point. And during Ace of Spades, which they're performing, the director keeps changing the camera shot from guitarist to guitarist based on who's switching from rhythm to lead because they're trading off. But he's not switching to the lead player. He keeps changing the camera to whoever's not playing a lead and just hitting the one chord over and over and over and over and over again. I've always wanted to know if that was a conscious choice to be a dick to the band, a conscious choice to be silly because the band didn't care and they were friendly with everyone making the show, or an unconscious choice because the person directing that episode didn't know enough about lead guitar playing to know that he was basically making what would be the illogical choice of who to focus on during those times. Lemmy would pop up in a lot of little movie cameos and TV shows here and there throughout his career. Very notably in some Troma films. He was the narrator for, I believe, Tromeo and Juliet, which I haven't seen, but I probably will someday. I know that the creator of Troma has said that it got to a point with his relationship with Lemmy that really all he wanted, Lemmy, when he would come to the set was not so much to get paid for a day's work, but just to have the company of 2 women and a large handle of Jack Daniels. So let me go back to where I left off with the No Sleep for Hammersmith going to number 1 timeline. We are getting to some rocky areas when it comes to Motorhead's narrative. We're getting into some contradictory stories, depending on if you're hearing this from Mick Wall, from Lemmy, from Fast Eddie, or from their manager, Doug Smith. At this time, there's lots of questions about where money's going and how come everyone's broke, blaming the manager, blaming Lemmy, et cetera, et cetera. And this would be an ongoing theme for Motorhead until much, much later in their career. I choose not to take sides, considering everyone is on drugs and getting in fistfights and not watching the books and just going from gig to gig to gig to sleep to drug deal to recording session to gig, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's hear a bit about Wendy O. Williams from Lemmy himself. Wendy O and her band, the Plasmatics, have been pretty much forgotten nowadays, but she was a completely outrageous punk rock agitator. She sawed guitars in half with a chainsaw and blew up police cars on stage. Once she drove a car into a pile of explosives on a New York harbor and jumped out at the last minute. After she did that, she went straight to Florida to wrestle alligators. I thought, this chick's fucking excellent. Plus, I'd seen pictures of her, and she did take a good picture. After our EP with Girls School hit, people were always on us to collaborate on records, especially with girls, and I really enjoy making records with birds. 8 geezers in the studio can really be a drag. Recording with girls usually produces better results because it causes an interesting kind of friction, and also the scenery is a bit better. Abrasiveness and scenery, I'm all for both, and it was clear I'd get that from Wendy O. It was touted as this extraordinary combination of punk and heavy metal, 2 warring factions at the time. The songs we were going to do were a Motorhead tune, No Class, Master Plan, which was a Plasmatics number, and as the single, Stand By Your Man. Yes, the country song. So let me interject now and talk about Fast Eddie Clarke leaving the band around this time. He hates the Plasmatics. He hates the idea of doing a novelty country song. He thinks they should go be recording an album of blues covers to sort of maintain their integrity. And footage of Fast Eddie Clarke himself in the last few years before he died has him actually saying that he was arguing with Lemmy that it was his band. Him saying, Lemmy, this is my band. You've got to listen to me. And, you know, the money we're going to get from this isn't worth it if it wrecks our reputation. And from Lemmy's side of things, in his own part of the narrative, he says, well, we were in the studio making the record. And then Phil Taylor comes and tells me that Eddie has quit. And we didn't think much of it because Eddie was in the habit of quitting every couple of weeks at that point. This time, we decided not to argue him back in the band, essentially. They decided to not go chase him down. And this leads to them basically finishing out their allotted amount of shows together, treating Eddie pretty poorly. If he doesn't want to be in the band, they decide that he's not going to share their accommodations. They have the roadies bring him down to like the boiler room of the venue that they're playing and you know, give him some food instead of having access to the green room where the rest of the band is, things like that on his last shows. So no love lost there. And they would then recruit Brian Robertson, who was making a solo album in Canada at the time, after being ousted or quitting Thin Lizzy, depending on who you ask. Brian Robertson comes into Motorhead because Lemmy and Phil Taylor are huge Thin Lizzy fans, and they think he can handle the Motorhead parts, and he certainly can. Problem is, he has the mentality that he's a special guest guitarist in Motorhead, and things don't go well. They make an album together called Another Perfect Day. It sounds different than previous Motorhead albums. It sounds a little bit more polished and a little more 80s when it comes to the guitar sounds and stuff. But I don't think of it as an 80s sounding album in any other way than a Motorhead 80s sounding album. I don't know that a lot of that production holds up too well, but it's also not it's not the kind of production that one looks back on fondly when you think of the 80s. I just don't think it works well for Motorhead in general. I could say the same thing about Orgasmatron, which came out after it. I think Rock and Roll, Orgasmatron, Another Perfect Day, all three albums have great songs on them that I love. So I'm not talking any trash about the writing, not talking any trash about the playing. I don't think they're as fun to listen to, but you might disagree. You might dig that a lot. So I definitely recommend checking out that era of Motorhead, as I do all eras of Motorhead. But with Brian Robertson, they run into this problem where he doesn't want to wear a bullet belt. He doesn't want to wear blue jeans. He wants to wear pink satin shorts and leg warmers on stage like he's doing an exercise program or something. And after he's gotten in the band long enough to sort of start dictating what he is and isn't going to do for the money they're paying him, he decides he doesn't want to play old songs like Ace of Spades anymore at all. So obviously that can't last. But it says a lot about Lemmy that he put up with that sort of treatment for a long time. It says a lot that he put up with two guitarists in a row that felt very possessive about the band that Lemmy started with three different people before the quote-unquote classic lineup. Also, if you look at a lot of photos, I can't remember if I've touched on this in this episode or not. I apologize. This episode has been made one little piece at a time for the last month. You don't see a lot of Motorhead photos, publicity photos with Lemmy in the middle and up front. You see Phil in the middle and up front. You see some with Eddie in the middle and up front. You see them standing up against a wall all together, kind of united. You don't see a ton of photos with, Lemmy trying to be front and center and take all the attention away from the other two, even though he's undoubtedly got to be the chief songwriter, even though he's giving everyone else songwriting credit on all these songs. I'm not going to go into the minutia of every person's life that was ever in Motorhead, but I will say both Fast Eddie Clarke and Phil Taylor were well taken care of financially. They didn't have to be in other bands or take other jobs to make a living after Motorhead. Obviously, Fast Eddie Clarke went on to be in a band called Fastway. I know they had some chart success. I don't know that they were the kind of thing that could really hold a candle to Motorhead as far as legacy goes. But I will use this time to talk some shit about Mick Wall, because Mick Wall likes to talk some shit himself, and he and I are developing a strange relationship. Or rather, I am developing a relationship with his books and with him, the perceived personality. He has no relationship with me, and I'm sure he never will. And I don't know. If I ever met him, I would love to say thank you for all the great things he's written for me to read and develop these shows off of, and just all what his writing did for my imagination as a young person. But, he speculates that Motorhead could have been as big as Metallica if Fast Eddie Clarke hadn't left, which is, I think, bullshit. I think that's nonsense speculation. I don't think they could have survived when someone makes a band miserable so much and keeps quitting. It doesn't matter what a journalist says about, how well they could have done if they didn't let him go. He was going to quit over something else if he didn't quit over this. And also, he was a great guitarist, but he was not an extraordinary guitarist. I don't believe he had a lot to do with the writing as much as Lemmy did. I believe you had to go on with somebody younger, like Phil Campbell, Phil Campbell would join the band after having seen, after growing up, but had seen Motorhead or Hawkwind when he was like 12 years old at a festival and waited outside to meet the band, and said Lemmy was the only one that signed any autographs for him. And he became his hero after that, or he was already kind of his hero, but he was definitely solidified in his mind as a hero. Lemmy, for his part, just says, I was the only one in Hawkwind that would come out and sign autographs. Getting Phil Campbell in the band, getting Wurzel in the band, getting Mickey D in the band from King Diamond's band. He was playing drums for King Diamond when Motorhead toured with them for a while. And he had been asked to join Motorhead before, but he stayed loyal to his employer at the time until much later when Lemmy called him again. And he was then free business-wise and said yes, and stayed in the band for the rest of the band's existence. So did Phil Campbell. They all had their problems too, as bands will, and weird attitudes and fights and things, but not like it was in the old days. And I think their contributions to the Motorhead legacy are pretty well set in stone. I don't think people look back on their work as fondly as the early stuff, but how can you? It's legendary, the early stuff. And it had a lot to do with everything that came after it, as far as heavy music goes and punk music goes and metal music goes and rock and roll in its own way. But Mick Wall likes getting this little dig in about how Motorhead would never achieve the same levels of success with later band members that they did with the classic lineup. But who did that stayed together for that period of time? I mean, Ozzy Osbourne's career kept going, but it was up and down in a lot of big ways. I don't know who you would compare. The problem is you can't compare Motorhead to anybody. They outlived everyone that they came up with practically. I'd say, I don't know, Deep Purple, I guess, started sooner than them and technically still exists. I don't know how many, maybe one band member, two, but I don't know what you expect from a band like Motorhead as far as maintaining number one status. I think it's very irresponsible and pointless to speculate on how much better they could have done. I don't think they could have been as big as Metallica ever. Although I will say, as much of a fan of Metallica as I have been most of my adult life, I love Motorhead and I love Metallica, but there's not a lot that I hate more than listening to Metallica playing Motorhead songs and James Hetfield trying to sing Motorhead songs. Kind of like the Cult. I love the Cult and I love Steppenwolf, but I really hate the sound of them doing Born to be Wild. Tangent. I apologize. I've digressed a bit once again, but this is the part of the show where I get to do that. I want to talk a little bit about the Orgasmatron record, and I can't let this go by without mentioning the fact that a lot of people may not realize Lars Ulrich from Metallica is on the inside album sleeve, or at least the original release of the inside album sleeve of Orgasmatron. He had come up to see Motorhead at the Beverly Sunset Hotel a couple of years before that album was released while they were in LA. And in Lemmy's words, he got a bit ill. He was still a youngster in those days, but it's a fallacy to say I taught him how to drink. I actually taught him how to throw up, and that's what he did, all over himself. That's what he got for trying to keep up with older people's habits. A photo of that classic moment in rock history appears on Orgasmatron. Scotty Ian from Anthrax also has a great story about trying to keep up with Lemmy, if you can find it. I believe it was published in the first edition of his autobiography that I eventually gave to someone else, and then I replaced with a later edition, and I can't find that story in the book. He also gave an interview about it at one point. It may be on the bonus disc extras for the Lemmy movie. I might be wrong about that, though. I don't have time to go watch them all. But it leads to Scotty in the next day being carried through an airport in Europe, shitting himself and vomiting simultaneously, and having to have a shot administered to him in the hotel by a German doctor that speaks no English. There's so much more to talk about when it comes to Lemmy's life and his career. There's a lot you could go into when it comes to Motorhead and what they accomplished, where they went, the fun stories they have. And if you're dying for more of that, I say, finish this episode, go online or go to a bookstore if you have those where you live, and get yourself a copy of Mick Wall's Lemmy and Lemmy's White Line Fever. Read them both if you want to know Lemmy inside out. There's tons of his attitude and his great stories about amazing people he knew and how many of them were dead by the time he wrote that book in his own autobiography. And there's a lot more business details and road stories from Mick Wall, who does do a great job of filling in the real day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-year existence of Motorhead during their time. I guess I'd like to kind of round this out by talking through some of my favorite Motorhead songs that I would recommend. Obviously, from the early stuff, you got Ace of Spades, you got Killed by Death, We Are the Road Crew, Bomber, The Case is Better Than the Catch. I realized I just mistakenly said The Case. I mean, Damaged Case, and The Chase is Better Than the Catch. A lot of stuff that was on No Sleep Till Hammersmith is great. A lot of stuff that was put out on the No Remorse set covers the early stuff recorded, in the studio, plus the stuff that they did with Robertson in the studio. So if you want to cap off everything that goes up into the early mid-'80s from the late '70s, that's not a terrible way to go with just the live album and that what was a 2-disc set when it came out. When it was on compact disc, I'm sure it was like 4 vinyls. I don't know. You're probably just finding these online anyways. I'm just throwing things out there. Would also obviously recommend Overkill, Over the Top. Check out... Let's see. Did I say Stay Clean? I'd say Shoot You in the Back. For some of the later 80s, 90s, I have to admit that I really, really, really do have a lot of affection for mid and late 80s stuff, early 90s stuff. I mean, Love Me Forever, Rock and Roll, Deaf Forever. It's fantastic. Orgasmatron. Oh, the song Motorhead, I've already talked about that, especially the live version. Going backwards a little bit, sorry. Getting into things like Going to Brazil, Black Leather Jacket, I'm So Bad Baby I Don't Care. Those are all great rock and roll songs. But Motorhead specific rock and roll songs. No Voices in the Sky is another great one. Then when we get into the 90s stuff, please check out songs like I Am the Sword and Burner and Hellraiser and something like Smiling Like a Killer, and listen to how heavy they get and how fast they get and how, I don't know, intimidating they are at a time, you know, when Megadeth and Pantera are writing jock jams. A time when Metallica is writing songs about racing a car really fast. Think about that when you listen to Burner and I Am the Sword. Definitely check out Sex and Death. I mean, and there's also tons more stories. I can't do justice to any of the tales about them palling around with the Ramones, the kind of camaraderie that they eventually enjoyed with bands like Metallica. Ozzy Osbourne, again, obviously. But I don't want to get into his health problems later in life. I don't want to get into him dying. I don't really want to get into other band members dying. It's not much to talk about. It's not as if they, blew themselves up with sticks of dynamite or anything. Just medical stuff. Medical stuff that happens when you get old. Check out the song I Don't Believe a Word if you want a really great statement of Lemmy as a lyricist and the singer with the kind of range that he had. It's very moody and it's very dramatic. I love it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I think that it's a bit out of the ordinary compared to what most episodes are going to be like, compared to what I've got coming up. I keep teasing the CBGB's episode, which I swear is happening, the Elvis episode, the Valley Girl episode, the Blackboard Jungle episode. All these have essentially been written and ready to record and researched, but the deeper I got into some of the Seattle bands, the deeper I got into Lemmy and Motorhead, I unfortunately just lost the desire to jump into shorter term projects until I could get these really, really, really nailed down. And I appreciate everyone being along this far into this episode. I will assume that a lot of folks listening to this specifically to learn about Motorhead and Lemmy aren't going to be hearing all the other episodes of this series. They might not be as interested in those movies, those eras in rock and roll history. I'm only loosely tying this into Airheads. This is not technically an Airheads episode. It's an Airheads addendum, I guess I would say. So after this, what I'm saying is I'm going to get back to being very distinct and direct about joining a certain artist with a certain film. I've got some good stuff coming up with The Doors, and it's not the Oliver Stone film. As always, I say to you, rock and roll is the greatest, and we are lucky to have it for as long as we do. And we are also lucky to have you for as long as we will, and as long as we can. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being alive. Thank you for listening. I remain, as ever, your humble servant, me.